Okay, we are live. Joining me today, a very special guest, Miguel Sebastián. So Miguel, for those who don't know you, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard, for having me here. So I'm an associate professor at the Philosophy Research Institute at UNAM in Mexico, and I work in philosophy of mind and cognitive science, mostly focused on understanding subjectivity as something that individuates conscious states and differentiates from other kind of states, attempting to explain that difference in representational terms, in terms of first-person representations, and then what is required for those kinds of representations. And I also have interest in metaphysics and other cognitive, the relation between consciousness and other cognitive processes like attention or reportability, and other issues also related to consciousness like vagueness or quantum mechanics.
Wow, that's quite a mouthful there. It's a lot of stuff that you got going on. I'm a really big fan of your work. I have been for a long time. I think that you write really good papers and really challenging and interesting arguments. So I'm very excited to have this discussion with you today. You just mentioned that you're interested in first-person representations and trying to use that to explain phenomenal consciousness. And I want to make sure that we have some time to talk about it. So I wonder if we could just start by asking you, what do you mean by a first-person representation, and what role do you think that it plays in theorizing about consciousness?
So here's one starting point in relation to consciousness. So you start by what is conveyed by the experience, what the experience dictates or says or mandate about the world, and then you figure out what it's required for a state to do something like that. So a couple of years ago, there was 30 years ago now, there was a refreshment of the relation between representations and consciousness. And then some people say, well, what it takes to have an experience as of red, representing red. But then you come and say, oh, but those are things that also allegedly, at least, unconsciously represented. Then some people started to figure out from different traditions, so that something over and above this, if we focus on perception, this primary object of perception is required to characterize. So for example, as you very well know, defenders of higher order theories focus on the fact that it has also to represent a relation that the subject bears to its state, or in the phenomenological tradition, people started to call attention to the fact that it also conveys something about the very subject of experience. And in particular, we say that those are subjective experience. That's something that's somehow reflected in the experience. So now try to characterize this element in representational terms require that if we had to use a sentence in order to express what is conveyed by the experience or what is the content of experience, that something like the first person pronoun would be required, as it has been stressed in higher theories, for example. One problem with that is that we have intentionality or representational relation are one of the most interesting and difficult issues in the mind-body problem. And we have theories that attempt to characterize what is required for a state to be a representational state and have the content that it has. But we do not have those theories for first-person representation. So we know that those are particularly interesting for things that people in philosophy of language, mainly like Perry or Lewis mentioned, and we lack those theories. So I'm trying to figure out how can we understand this subjectivity in those representational terms.
Right. So in terms of critiquing standard representational theories of consciousness, you think that merely representing red, representing that something red is in the environment isn't enough, because it has to bring in somehow that this is a state of the subject. You think that's missing from standard representational theories?
Yeah, exactly. So I think that if we articulate what is the content of experience, the experience does not merely convey the presence of this object, but also the relation that I bear to it at the very least. So one is in a position, and that is difficult to articulate, maybe sufficiently imprecise. One is in a position to determine that not only the world is such and such, but also the relation that oneself brings to the world.
So do you think that this is the sort of thing that occurs in unconscious perception as well, or is just a representation of the object is enough?
So at the unconscious, so one thing that I would be willing to say without argument is that those first personal representations do not happen at the unconscious level. At least this is my shot. It's like if I trying to articulate what distinguishes conscious from unconscious state, and I want to focus on this first personal aspect, I have to deny that. So one of the reasons to think so is that first person representations, at least unconscious of some kind, have not been postulated at the unconscious level. Of course, we have things like thoughts or unconscious beliefs. So if Freud were right, I might believe that my father, or think that my father wanted to kill my father. So this would be a first person decided. But the kind of non-conceptual first person representation that I would have in mind, they do not appear, have not been postulated. They have been postulated in perception. They have been postulated to play a role in personal processes, but not at the unconscious level. So of course we would need a theory that explains what is it required in order to have one of those representations. So two ways, and then if those processes happen at the unconscious level, then what I'm saying would be wrong, or an argument that shows why those representations are required at the unconscious level.
So what kind of, so I know from some of your earlier work that you think that there's something like a proto-self maybe involved at some level. Would that occur at the unconscious level? I'm just trying to get at whether you think states at the unconscious level, well, why are they perceptual states if they don't involve some sort of I'm seeing this, or this is happening from my perspective?
So this is okay. Fair enough. So one of the things that I'm working on, as you know, there is an ongoing discussion on unconscious perception.
Yeah.
Well, an ongoing or a year, depends on how you count ongoing, led at least by people like Ned Block and Ian Phillips on the possibility of unconscious perception. If you buy the idea that unconscious, so perception has to be personal level, then the next question that arises is, okay, what is required for a representation to be a personal representation, or those they focus, so within the discussion, they focus on action. And I think that the problem with action is that there are many notions of action. And depending on the notion of actions that you use, you can have one result or other. So in articulating this debate, one problem in this discussion is that they intend to be neutral, at least with regard to whether cognitive access is required for consciousness. And then there seems to be no room to claim that you need intentional action. That is what Ian Phillips said. And at the same time, maintaining the claim that cognitive access might not be, so at least at the very least remaining neutral, that cognitive access might not be. So my take required. So my take on that would be, okay, then here's one way to understand what does it mean for a representation to be personal, a la Barthes. So it's like, oh, if it has a first person, if it's a essay of first personal representation, in which case there wouldn't be unconscious perception. I'm fine with that. So I'm worried about consciousness, that's what I find, and not on what do we decide that is perception. So if you want to tell me that a representation in the early visual cortex is not perception because perception is this personal process, blah, 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 then I say, okay, fine.
So, okay.
Does it make sense?
Yeah, right. So it's a lot of that debate. I think part of what you're saying, at least, is that a lot of that debate is terminological. Whether you want to call those states perception or not. Someone like, I mean, I don't know, the debate with Ian Phillips, I feel like a lot of times that's almost entirely terminological. Do we want to call those things perceptions as opposed to whatever else we call them? I don't know. Content fixations or something, I guess the way Dennett might phrase it. But whichever way you call them, your view is that there are no representations that involve the self at that level.
there are no representations that involve the self at that level. Yes.
Okay. So go ahead. Sorry.
No. So keep going, and then if I might be willing to make some specification. But
okay.
On,
well, no, I would just trying to get clear on what your theory is, so that there are these. You have a representation of something in the environment. It's a red apple, let's say. It's not conscious yet. So at some point it gets connected to or processed by or accessed, or I don't know what the right terminology in your view would be. So that's one of the questions I have. But somehow it's connected up with a self-representation, at which point then you have a phenomenal conscious state. So what is actually the relationship there, I guess, is what I'm.
So here's the way of putting it. So I think that in this previous work, one of the things that were not very helpful, but I was borrowing some notions of Damasio. So the fact that the proto-self was involved was not very helpful. So because it seems to be like, as you mentioned, like you have a representation of the self, and that's not. So I'm not claiming that the self or something like the self has to be represented or is an object of the experience as the red apple is. All that I'm saying is that the content of experience concerns the subject. So in other words, if we make use of possible centered world semantics, what I'm saying is that they determine a function from worlds and individuals to truth value. So the correctness conditions of the state depend on the subject. A couple of things would be interesting. So I do think that there are conscious the hink representations. So namely, representations that concern the location. So the here, for example, in the dorsal cortex, there are visual representations that carry information about my location. So how the objects are located relative to my location. So in order to determine its correctness conditions, I need to appeal to the here. What I don't think that is required at that level is that they have to be evaluated with regard to a subject. So this is the semantic. Now, on top of that, what is required is what is required in order to make these kind of partitions to determine function from center worlds to truth value. So what is demanded from a system? Here's one possibility. Oh, maybe it's the deployment of something like the I concept. That would be on theory. I don't think that is conceptual. So I think that the content of experience is not articulated. There is no symbol that plays this role. And then, and it's not non-conceptual in this sense. And then what is required is a theory. So, well, then explain me what is required in order to have this content. In a previous work, so if we consider sender-receiver structure, in this previous work, I was focusing on the sender. What do we need to track? So it's not only tracking information about the primary object of experience, but also about my the processes that determine the kind of entity that I'm fundamentally are. Something like a self-maintaining system according to biology. Now I'm working on developing these ideas just very separated from consciousness, where I'm focusing on what the consumer is required. So the fact that a complexity of systems consume these representations, which is a system that is dedicated and that depends on the right function. So this is something that I owe you, something that I'm working on, and something that I'm trying to develop. So there are like two steps. First, trying to argue that the relevance that first-person representations play in consciousness, and then a theory that explains, okay, what is required to do so.
Okay, that's very interesting. So it's not. So this is part of your disagreement with the higher order theories, because on those theories they agree that the self is involved in some level, but they usually posit an explicit kind of representation. Using the mental analog of the term I. So, I am seeing red, or I am feeling pain, either, in the form that I'm most familiar with, the higher order thought, or some kind of higher order state that represents that the self is having these first order sorts of representations. You want to deny that. There's no concept involved in these.
So I want to claim that there is no, I don't think that at the simplest level in which I want to locate consciousness, I don't think that those kind of symbols are required. So you don't need a structure that's like the as you claim, the analog of the I concept. So this is one point of disagreement. So I think here, so let me bring something, because I also want to know what you think about that, if you don't mind.
No. Yeah.
With the way in which theories have been taxonomized, representational theories. So we have like first order representational theories, higher order representational theories, same order, which might or might not be versions of higher order theories. I think that this taxonomy is not very fruitful and not very useful for the following reason. So I think that the only reason, the main difference among these theories is a discussion on what is the content of experience. So what is the content of the state you are in when you're having the experience? So the first order representation would say the red apple. A higher order theories would say, no, it conveys also something about the experience and also about oneself. Well, I mean, David Rosenthal's theory, at least, but for example, Richard Brown's theory would claim, no, it conveys something about the subject and some other state. So I'm more in line with a horror theory in that sense. So
is this say that's me?
Yeah. So I think that the experience conveys something with regard to the state the subject is in. So something that I'm working on is what is the motivation to say that the experience itself has to be represented. I think that one comes from Chartian traditions. You find also those elements in Buddhist traditions.
Yes.
I don't find them compelling. And the other reason comes from the transitivity principle, which is David Rosenthal's idea that a conscious state is a state one is aware of oneself as being. So the problem is that if we call conscious states to the state so there is some state that I have to satisfy in order to have the experience. I'm going to call that conscious. If we call that a conscious state and then we apply this transitivity principle, one is tempted to think that conscious states in both appearances of the word conscious state have to be the same. I completely disagree. So, and that's the problem that appeared a couple of years ago with the misrepresentation. So you're definitely familiar with that. So, but one thing is what is the kind of state that you have to be in? And if I call that conscious state, and then there is a conscious state 2, which is the state I am aware of myself as being. So what forced you to claim that those uses are the same? So for the higher thought, the state you are in when you're having the experience is not the state you are aware of yourself as being. But what's the problem? So you figure out the idea. So there are some points. So I think that whether the subject or the states or what is the discussions in terms of what is the content of experience or what is conveyed by the experience or how the hell we're going to get clear about that if we're if we're interested in representational theories of consciousness are the main interest rather than levels and blah, blah, because I think the main distinction between a higher theories and a first order theories is what is required from the state you're in when you're having the experience. What does it have to represent? The higher order theories would say a thought of this form. And
so there's a lot there to unpack. Let me see if I'm getting the gist of it. So you don't think that the distinctions between first order, same order, higher order is a very good way of dividing up the landscape, because that's, I mean, what level we're at isn't really what's at debate or what the main point of the debate is. Sounds like what you're saying is that you take the main debate to be, how is the experience phenomenologically from my point of view? Does it indicate something about me or not? Or does it, so this is more of an issue about transparency? Is that, or is that misreading what you're saying?
That's so I don't like the use of transparency very much, because about what the experience conveys or what one is in a position to come to believe. All that I'm saying is that so in line with what you were saying is that the main difference between, say, higher order thought and so higher order theories in general and first order theories is a difference in what does the state one is in when having the experience represent. So one says it represents red apple, the other says no, it represents that I am in having the experience, or I am in such and such state.
Right.
So for example, you and I guess, would disagree. So you were not very convincing. You intended it, at least in your paper, as a price to be paid. I disagree with you. I mean, you have to give some points when you were writing. I think that is it required for the experience itself to be represented, so that motivates some mental state, what I call mental state involving representations, state. It's required that the experience represent itself as, for example, Raya Kriegel has defended. I don't think so. I think that what is relevant is that the subject herself is somehow represented, not as an object, but rather as an element with respect to which the experience has to be evaluated.
Right. So, and that's, I mean, you're referring to my paper. I'm not sure which part of it you're disagreeing with. Not that I'm really, we don't have to get all distracted by this, but you said you disagreed. So I'm not exactly sure which part you're disagreeing with, because I agree with you that, well, I mean, it's a bit tricky. So if you take someone, just as a segue here, if you take someone like Ned Block, who says that, look, there's some kind of awareness of your conscious states involved, but it's not a separate state. It's not a cognitive kind of awareness. It's, I guess if you pressed him hard enough, he would say it's a very deflationary sense of awareness that, just like I smile my own smile, so I'm aware of my own conscious states. And that's only if you press him really hard. At other times, though, he seems to want some kind of notion of awareness, which is just not cognitive. It doesn't involve a thought or cognitive access or something like that. So it at that point, it becomes very hard to make a distinction between first order and higher order types of theories, because here's a person who's championed what most people think of as a first order theory, saying, no, I want some kind of awareness involved, but just not a higher order kind, but really what he means is a cognitive kind. So it seems like really what's at issue is what you're trying to say, I think, is what's the representational content of these conscious experiences. That's more of what the heart of the debate is about.
So I think that you take it completely right. So there is one debate with regard to what is the content. So, and then I think that someone can be a higher order theorist and give up that this form of awareness has to be something cognitive. So as you know, I tend to think that this form of awareness is not something cognitive. It's not noticing, right? Like realizing or cognitive access. Right. So this is one discussion, but this is neutral on the motivation of the other discussion. They might so champions of this debate, like David Rosendahl, they are willing to have them together, and then maybe they're right. But those are separate. So one discussion is on what is the architecture that underlies the experience. So whether we have to notice that or not, or be in a position. So if something like global workspace or working memory, if this is the kind of architecture that we have, do those mechanisms underlies the mechanism responsible for consciousness? And I think if they don't, higher theories or those that thinks that some awareness of the kind of states we're in or the kind of relation that we bear to the world are perfectly alive. So, but you're completely right. This is the way that the debate has been going.
Right. So I'm not clear about what. So I mean, I know what you don't agree with about my particular view, which is I think it's a cognitive kind of awareness. And I'm not a true believer of this stuff. I'm not someone who really thinks I know this is true. Or I think it's a view that should be taken seriously. That's about as far as I'm willing to go. I think there's some evidence for it, some empirical evidence, which I take the most seriously. So that's interesting. I think maybe there's some evidence against it. You've presented some interesting evidence. We can talk about the stuff about dreams if you're interested in doing that. So I take that kind of stuff seriously. So I don't, I'm not trying to push my own view here, but I am curious what part of, so on the view that I defended, there's not this two-level kind of structure. Phenomenal consciousness simply is having the right kind of a representational state. I'm aware of myself as seeing red. The explanatory power comes from the content of the higher order state. A lot of that sounds like what you want to say, minus all the cognitive stuff and the explicit analog of I or something like that. And that's what you're saying is where you want to make a distinction between the kinds of debates higher order theories want versus the stuff that you think is more interesting.
So here's the only point of exactly what you say is what I think. So the only point of disagreement that I mentioned before, so cognitive processes aside and conceptual processes aside, so those are the main difference. It's just that when you were writing, when you were presenting your view, you claim that giving up to the idea that the experience itself has to be represented is a price worth paying. And then what I was saying is that it's not a price worth paying, but there are no good reasons. So I was trying to argue that the experience itself does not have to be represented. So as you might perfectly agree with that, there is no further point of disagreement.
Oh, okay.
So it was just a rhetorical way in which you presented the idea.
Right,
so
that it was a cost.
You presented it. It was just rhetoric, probably, in the way. So it's fine.
Yeah, I mean, I do get a lot of pushback on that because people, I mean, there's a very strong intuition that people have that, it's the first order states that should be somehow doing all this work. And I think that's an empirical question. It's open for debate. We shouldn't decide it sort of based on intuitions. But people do have suggested that that's a worry. So that's what I was responding to rhetorically. You're right about that. So that's very interesting. So one thing that came up is that it sounds like you think that phenomenologically, sort of from what it's like, there's the self involved. Is that correct on your view? That part of the evidence is phenomenology of self involving?
So here's, yes, and that might be a further point of disagreement. So I think that if we get to the idea, and I'm pseudo quoting ideas from Uriah again. In this case, it's like the motivation of something like the transitivity principle, even if the folk psychological principle, has to have some ground. And I think so that something, my best bet to motivate it is as follows. So the experience does not merely convey something about the way the world is, but also about my relation. So one is immediately in a position to relate herself to the world. And this is something that is phenomenologically manifest. I'm not claiming that the I, also the self, is something like an object. It's rather like an articulated constituent in Paris terms, or an implicit representation in Recanati's terms. I don't want to appeal to implicit representation, but the idea would be the same. The reason why I don't want Recanati's implicit representation is that he offers a theory of what it takes to have an implicit representation of oneself, which is grounded in consciousness, and then the project is dead. So I want to go the other way around. I want to ground consciousness on this form of implicit representation. But as he's famous and he take the word implicit representation, I'm going to use the different word. It's like this constituent, so something first personal is there. So it puts you in a position. There has to be some indexical element there. And this is something that is problematic for higher thought. I don't think so. So because if the higher thought is an unconscious one, then what this state conveys is not something that can be phenomenologically manifest. But again, I think this is going to depend on the different uses of the word conscious. So I think that this element is somehow phenomenologically manifest. It's given in the experience.
Right. So and I know you have a paper that's coming out in Philosophical Studies on specifically this point and higher order theory. So I wonder if, I don't want to get too bogged down spending time talking about higher order theories, but I mean, your views are, the way you present them sound similar, although you have a lot of disagreements. That's part of what the taxonomy, I think, the way people divide up the literature or the debate is sort of what you're pressing on, is that you want to make room for some self-involvement, but not the kind of involvement that is at the higher order level, or at least in this terms of cognitive sense. But so one of you, I mean, so I wonder if you could clarify your argument that at least on David Rosenthal's version of it, there's a problem with securing the reference of the I term in it. So what is exactly the problem that you see there?
So so as I was mentioning, so first point of agreement is like, oh, you need something like first person representation, there's a representation. And then the second step, and this is something that everybody that thinks that this is required need to provide, we need what I call a metasemantic theory, namely a theory that explains what is required from a state to have this kind of content. And this is something that is not, so either you have theories that explain that in terms of consciousness, like Recanati or Peacock, or the one that David offered. So David says, you know, it's a disposition to identify the subject of the reference of the higher thought with the subject that appears there. But in order, so what I do in this paper is that if this disposition has to be manifested, there has to be circumstances. If we have the disposition, there has to be, for a cognitive system like us, circumstances under which we are able to do this identification. We definitely can do it in the case of the higher thought. The higher thought has to be conscious so that I can make the identification. So what does the subject of the higher thought is, then the higher thought has to be conscious. And that's perfect, okay? The problem is that if the second order thought has to be conscious under some circumstances, it has to be possible for an architecture like this one, in order to secure the reference of this higher thought, that you need to deploy a third order thought, which also deploys the first person pronoun, okay? What fixes the reference of this first person pronoun? The disposition to blah, 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 blah. And then there has to be circumstances under which, for architecture like us, if we have this disposition, the third order thought becomes conscious. So we have regressium ad infinitum, a vicious one, because systems like us cannot satisfy the whole family of disposition that is required to guarantee the first one. So right. This is the argument basically in this paper.
Right. So, and David's view about this is a bit slippery, and it's good. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with the argument, but I think it's good that you make the argument because it highlights this kind of issue in the theory. I mean, David, what Rosenthal wants is to secure something like the essential indexical, because he believes that in these kinds of thoughts, there has to be direct reference, some kind of immediate reference to the subject. But then how do you reconcile that with the claim that these thoughts are mostly unconscious? And as you say, his solution is, well, there's a disposition. The disposition is simply that if someone pressed you, you would and say, who is thinking this thought or who is having this pain? You would say, it's me. Now, your point is that in order to do that, the higher the thought itself has to be conscious. So I'm wondering why you think
there has to be circumstances under which, no, it doesn't have to be conscious. So, if you want to make the identification, if you want to actualize the disposition, then you can do only that. I mean, I don't know what it would mean to do so, but if you ask me, I don't know what you're talking about if I'm not conscious of the higher state. So I don't claim that the higher thought has to be conscious, but there has to be circumstances in order to have where where the disposition can be manifested.
Right.
So so let me say one thing from the intellectual perspective. I think that the argument might be, I think that is a very nice one, and you might disagree, but the most important point is that thinking about those issues, so if something like let me call it, something first personal is required, serious thinking of what is required for this kind of representation is important.
Yeah.
So so a meta-semantic of first-person representation or necessary representation is required. So David offered one. I think it doesn't work this is one reason. So I mentioned without argument that I don't like the fact that you need something like a symbol there. This is the most, so calling the attention to the need of something along these lines is intellectually more important the argument, which I think is cool and I think it works. But it's my argument, it's my paper, and I mean there might be ways of resistance. So philosophers are pretty smart people, and they find out ways of or something along this line, or maybe something different. Maybe this doesn't work. So I say for rhetorical reason, this is the fitting for higher theories. Give me a different theory.
Right. No, I agree. I think the most important point is they point out the need for this kind of discussion. I think that's exactly right. So the details of how to resist it from this point of view of David's theory aren't going to be nearly as interesting as just highlighting the fact that this is a deficiency. There are a lot of theories of consciousness that require something like this that don't have it. David's offered one, so he's ahead of the game a little bit, I think. Now, I think the disposition manifests itself in various ways. I mean, part of the problem is that we hardly ever have to do this. I mean, the conditions under which it would manifest are very rare. No one ever really stops to ask the question, how do I know who's having this thought, or who is it that's really having the thought?
That's fine, but it's important. So here's what I don't like. We always do that, but here's something that I don't like. You're gonna probably read in the future many times that I do this thing. Talks explanation in terms of dispositions.
Yes.
So because those are perfectly fine at the very beginning, but then we need to require exactly what is required from a system. So what I was trying to develop is this idea. So if you claim that a system has this disposition, then of course that we never ever do that. But there has to be, if we have this disposition, there has to be circumstances under which the disposition can be manifested. If this disposition cannot be manifested, then I don't know in which sense we have this disposition. So we are characterizing the kind of cognitive architecture that we have by appeal to disposition. That's fine. But then what I try to show in the paper is that, then you would be committed to all these kind of things. That of course we never do it, but there had to be an infinite. So we should be able to entertain an infinitely long higher thought, and for finite. Of course, we very rarely have more like a third or four other. That's the very and only philosophy probably.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to argue that it is required that the architecture that we are describing is able to do this if we want to claim that that we have this position. That's more like the point.
Right. No, and I agree with that. I just wonder why you think that it has to have the I in it. So if I say ouch, and then you say, who's in pain? Then I say, well, I am. You say, well, who's that? I say, I don't know, the guy who teaches at LaGuardia and sitting right in front of you. I mean, it doesn't seem like I have to say I again in order to secure the reference to me. I just give you a bunch of descriptions.
But you need so you need to identify. So the reason that I gave, I see the point. So the reason that I gave in the paper is that you need to identify the subject in the higher thought, know who is in pain, but so somebody thinks, I'm in pain, and then it has to be the subject of this particular thought. So right. You need to know which thought I'm talking about, not only who is in pain. So at least this is my understanding. So it's the disposition to identify the subject in the higher thought. So you need to be able to refer to this particular higher thought, which is the one of which we want to secure the reference.
Yeah,
that's the idea.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I think maybe you're getting, or I don't know, but who knows? Every time I think I got David's view right, he tells me, no, that's not my view. And I say, fine, I'll write a paper saying it's my view then. But so I don't know how he would respond to that. But it seems to me that when he says you have to, the thinker of this very thought, it doesn't require that you express the thought by saying I'm in pain. And then someone says, well, who's in pain? And not who's thinking the thought I'm in pain. But even if you did do that, you wouldn't have to identify the thought. You just say, it's this guy, it's this one. I'm the one thinking the thought. That's who it is. But you don't think that would work though?
As you move in this direction, my impression is that as you try to move in this direction, then it is less clear to me what does it have to do with the metasemantic of the element used in the higher thought. So that might be a promising way of going, but then it's like, really, does that give us a metasemantic of the symbol that is deployed in this thought? That's so.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to keep in mind too that there are two things going on here. One is that So if we want to appeal to, because I agree with you about the phenomenology, that the self is involved, phenomenologically, that it's present or presented to me in some sense. And I think that's explained by the fact that there's this thing in the higher order thought that says I am in this state, so that if that determines what if you accept, as I tend to sometimes accept, that phenomenology is determined by the content of these kinds of higher order awarenesses, then what it will be like is me having the state, because that's what that's what's represented. So that's the way I think the phenomenology gets in. It's because it's in the content of the relevant thought. But then it's a separate question: how does that thought refer to the self? And that's what the disposition stuff is. It's not supposed to explain the phenomenology, but explain how it's referring to me and not you. So those are two different tasks, I think. So
you are completely right. So I agree with every word you have said. So
wow.
Just leave it open. So whether thought or what representations, and that's exactly. So I might say something. I want you to know, because I'm writing on that, and that might be helpful. And given that we're here discussing, I think that would be fun. So it's important to clarify the sense in which the subject is involved in the representation. So some people, when you say, oh, I don't find anything selfish, like Jesse Prince, for example, appealing to Hume. So some people read Hume and say, oh, I don't find myself. So it's important to characterize the way in which the self is present in the experience. And my best bet is, and I want to know what you think about that, is that it's similar to the here. So it is not controversial that my visual experience is the hink. By that, I mean that this thing presents objects from here. So this is to the right and to the left. Now, if I ask you to introspect the here-ness, you're going to say, yeah, it's there, but what I'm... so I think that the I, the self, is like the here-ness. It's introspect the I-ness is like, yeah, it's there, but it's not like the apple or the I have cups here. So this is I think that, well, that is as it plays the role of this indexical, this is the way in which it's present in the experience. The here-ness is part of the correctness conditions of the state. But when you attempt to introspect, it's like, how do I introspect the here-ness? I don't know. So it's like, it's there. So I think that the I-ness or the self-ness is something like this kind of structural element. And this is why some people is like, oh, I don't want to, or are more willing to accept first-order theories. I think this is wrong. But
yeah,
I don't know.
No, I tend to agree. You don't find it as an object sitting out there in your visual field. Yeah. That's not the way that it presents itself, which is what you're saying, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
no, I agree. So how, on your view, then, is this secured?
So in the theory that I have, what we need to do in general, you don't have a pronoun, so you need a state which correctness conditions correspond to these differentiate ways the word are for a subject. So this is like, during philosophy of language, but what the heck is required from a neural system or a brain in order to do so? And then what is required, so in previous work, what I claim is that developing on Lewisian ideas, so what is required is that you don't need to identify the object. So so what you need from the state is that is adequate or incorrect depending on the subject. What did I do in past work? So I appeal to what the kind of entities that can do that, like organisms. So what are organisms? Self-maintaining system. And I was appealing to the mechanisms responsible for self-maintenance and the role, the interaction between representations. So in the case of perception, the interaction between representations of the world and the systems that are responsible for these homeodynamic processes. Now, I try to do, so I'm more interested in what other ways could be to do it. And I think that this is a combination. So in this case, I made use in this past work of the work by Damasio, who calls this a structure that is responsible for the homeodynamic, the proto-self. Proto-self is a bad word because it's like, oh, and then represent something that is self, and then it's like cheap. So you're just cheating. You're just bringing something that's selfish and put it there. So what I think is that it has to do in a paper that I'm working, if we manage to agree in what we want to say on the fact that is you have a dedicated system, a system which is dedicated to the subject and which has a derivative function depending on the system that it is. This way you get the indexicality and the immunity to error. So in the case of allocation, so for a process relative to a location, the hink content would be, so if this sensor is just, its function is not only to track red object, but the objects that are in front of it. So its function depends on the system, on the system they are integrated. Then you have something like this. Can get something like this, the hink content. But I don't think that the hink or this relativeness to the here-ness is sufficient for the I-ness. And then what we are trying to do is like to appeal to, given that this representation is consumed by a variety of processes, for some of them it would be adequate to characterize it in terms of the hink representation, but for others, something like more first personal would be required. So by combining this sender, so what the sender does on the one hand and what the receiver does on the other, I'm attempting to do so. So something, this is still an ongoing project.
So that at the end, what you get is a representation of the objects belonging to the self, because of the dynamics between the senders and the receivers?
So you always get, so for the theories, for the kind of theories that I'm more familiar with, you get content from something like sender-receiver structure. Mm-hmm. So these informational theories and telesemantic theories, they appeal to sender-receiver structures, and then the content of the message is determined by the sender receiver. So that's what with those theories to determine what it takes to represent red or to represent, hey, I'm here. And this thing is not something which is articulated, at least the most basic form. So it's something like there is a fly around in the unfamous frog case of Millikan. Now, what I'm trying to do is how this structure has to be complicated or articulated in order to get this indexical, this essential indexical component. That's what I'm trying to play at this level rather than playing at the level of the concepts, because I think that concept is something more demanding than those simple representation. And I tend to think that consciousness arrives at those more simple level. One problem is that, if that's too simple, then maybe we have unconscious one and the theory is wrong.
So that'd be a way to empirically test it, at least. So that's interesting, because I know that recently in a paper of yours, you've been critical of teleosemantic theories because of your random man or rando man. So that's interesting that you want to still invoke something like a teleosemantic theory. So can you tell us, like, what part of the theory are you criticizing, and what part are you trying to save?
So, those are one of those things. You learn a lot about one theory, it's interesting, and then you criticize what doesn't work. That's what happened with teleosemantics or with higher order theories, that, as we have seen, there are many things that I endorse and like. So there are like two components. A theory of mental contents requires to unpack the apparent normativity of the representations, namely the fact that something is right or wrong. Teleosemantic theories have two elements. So on the one hand, you have this sender-receiver component, the informational component. In order to unpack this normativity, they appeal to an etiological notion of function at Millikan. So typically is this etiological notion of function that the one that is doing the job of saying when it's right and when it's wrong, when it's adequate or when it's inadequate. So what I did in this paper is like develop on Swapman idea. It's classical, but so teleosemanticists have tried to resist this and still maintain that we need an etiological notion of function. By etiological, I mean one that depends on the evolutionary history. Now, for consciousness, I cannot believe, so I don't think that the evolutionary history is relevant to the kind of experience. So just fix the system and you get the phenomenology. So, of course, in order to unpack this idea, I wouldn't appeal to an etiological notion of function. Then we have something like, so organizational theories attempt to do that by means of homeodynamic processes, which would be more in line with previous work. But this point of criticize is, it's like playing there. So I think that those naturalistic theories of mental content are the most promising, or the ones that are like the most. They have some handicaps. Maybe in order to unpack more complex representations, we need to appeal to something like an etiological function. At the very least, some fundamental level, it better not be. So
So one of the questions I have about this is, for instance, for Millikan, she's not interested in talking about consciousness. I know because I've tried to get her to talk about it several times, and she's it's interesting to her, but she's not. That's not what the theory is about. The theory is about mental content and intentionality. And what's interesting is, Davidson came up with Swamp Man, got famous from him, but Millikan talked about Swamp Man before Davidson in her language thought, another biological category. She says some people might think this is an objection to my theory of the person, just shows up with no history, they have no mental content. She says, well, before judging this, and I know you know this, but before judging intuition-wise your feelings about it, we should have a theory of intentionality first. That's her move, is that we do the theorizing first and then we check the case. So she bites the bullet and says, yeah, Swamp Man has no intentional states. In fact, I talked to her recently about this, and I asked her about CRISPR technology, and in particular about this particular scientist who's trying to bring back the woolly mammoth by taking DNA that they have from some bones and splicing it with modern elephants. And so, I asked her, this woolly mammoth, if they ever build one, does it have intentional states or not? Her answer was she doesn't care. So her theory is not meant to address it. And she thinks it sort of depends on what kind of generalizations we can make about the behavior of the animal and these other things. But ultimately, and this is sort of what you call the real nature case, I think, in your paper. Ultimately, what she's interested in explaining is not these possible kinds of cases, but actual animals in our world that we actually live in and how they get to have content to their mental states. So I'm wondering how you might respond to that, given that I know you want an actual case, but the random man is not really an actual case. And she might respond in the same way, that that's just not what the theory is built to do. So
that's what I try to do in the paper, is that you cannot ignore those cases. So I don't care whether, so the reason why I brought random man, which is simply, an DNA chain that comes from mere random combinations of numbers, is that get one of those beings, or in your example, take this artificial system, or take whatever. So the question is, okay, we need to explain their linguistic abilities. So those beings are going to have linguistic abilities, are going to have cognitive capacities. How are those explained? My point is, if you can explain those without appealing to representations, then so can ours be explained.
So why do they need to be explained, though?
Why?
Why?
So repeat, I didn't hear the question.
I'm just asking, why do we need to explain those kinds of the capacities of random man or of these other creatures?
So under the following situation, if I were to produce one of those beings, which can be produced, we would be willing to explain their behavior. So it's only best, because if they don't have representations, then how do you explain? So you say, I don't care about explaining that. I say, well, I'm trying to understand what is the nature of representation. I take representations to be not mere theoretical postulates, but some kind, and I want to move in that because I'm not sure about what a natural kind is,
Yes.
but something like a natural kind. So when in neuroscience or in psychology we talk about representations, it means something, the way in which it's used might differ, but is something that has these correctness conditions and has this, it's about other things or carries information or whatever you want it to be unpacked. And those are the tools we have to explain how this cognitive architecture works and how this behavior works. Now, if this depends on an evolutionary history, there might be cases which lack this, but behave as I do. So is possible is a different explanation possible? Then let's look for it. So that would be like I don't think we want to understand the nature of those things that we are postulating. So I don't think that this move, at least for someone like me, would be available. Maybe Millikan is just interested, just, I want to do that, but we want to understand what is the nature of those things we're talking about.
Right. So, I mean, I agree, but I think that some of the debate here might be on what it means to be the nature of something. So for her, the nature of it is given by the etological, historical selection process in the past. That is its nature. I mean, insofar as you want to speak about natures, these other things, whether they have natures at all, that's seems like an open question. And if you already have a theory which suggests that they don't, then it seems like you shouldn't go insisting that they do.
Okay, how about this? So imagine that what I do is I copy just by copying you get the chip. No, I couldn't do that. So you need some random process. Yeah,
exactly.
That's fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, I don't agree. I'm not saying I agree. I'm just saying that I think that this is the way that she would respond. I mean, I remember being in the class with her, and she was talking about Swamp Man, saying, he just doesn't have any thoughts. He's not thinking about anything. Swamp Davidson goes and teaches a class. He has no thoughts. He doesn't mean anything by what he says. I was like flabbergasted. So it's hard for me to accept. But that's what she said.
But then explain. So okay, fair enough. But then explain your cognitive capacities. Yeah. And you say, I don't care. I don't care about that. That's fine. But I do care. Yeah. And then what do I do?
Exactly. So I take that point. That's interesting. So I want to sort of keep us on track here. There's a lot of interesting things that are coming up. One of the things you mentioned earlier was the distinction between access and phenomenal consciousness. And I've seen that you put this this is a vexed question. I don't want to, we get too bogged down in talking about overflow and that stuff, although I, have a vested interest in talking about it. But one of the things I like about your work is you put this to some really new kind of interesting work. So I read a paper of yours where you were trying to say, well, the possibility of zombies kind of depends on people overlooking this distinction. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you think how this plays out.
So here, the idea in this paper was the following. So assume that there is a distinction between access and phenomenology. Now, in the two-dimensional framework and the argument, one of the ideas is that the primary intention and the secondary intention, so what things are and what things seems, are, in the case of consciousness, are identical. So what I was trying to do is we form our concept, so how things seem to us, on the basis of the access we have to the experience. Now, the access that we have, so there is room for a distinction between the primary and secondary intention of consciousness if I remember now the primary intention, the secondary intentions. So if the primary intention depends on the cognitive access and the secondary, the real nature depends on some of the process. So there is room for a difference there, and then you cannot make the inference that is required by the argument.
So what would be happening at the case of the alleged zombie world? So you conceive of a world as microphysical duplicate of you running around saying I'm conscious, self-representation, but it's not conscious. So you respond by saying that they have different access properties than we do.
They have the same access properties that we do, and they lack the So it's like, so you have the access property, and then you don't have the phenomenology. So you form. So there might be a case. It's like it's might be useful to think of access as a higher order, just for the sake of illustration.
Okay.
As a form of higher order thought. They form the thought, but they do. If the phenomenology do not correspond to what the a higher order state says, but something else, and just then you have this. So the zombie would have the access property, but wouldn't lack the phenomenological one.
But it can't be a physical duplicate in that case.
It's not a physical duplicate. Yeah, definitely, it's not a physical duplicate.
Right. So you have to object to the setup of the zombie argument still, like by when they say it's a microphysical duplicate with different
what people are, what they're figuring out is something, but it happened the same in the case. So all the cases in which the primary and the secondary intention do not coincide would be basic. So you cannot imagine. So can you imagine watery stuff that is not H2O? Yes, you can, but that wouldn't be a duplicate, a physical duplicate of the actual world. What you're imagining, so it's the same here. You're completely right. So in this case, what I'm imagining is not a duplicate, a real duplicate. So yeah, but it's the same.
So why do you need? So I mean, why do you? Not that I want to disagree with you, but I'm just curious why you think the distinction between access and phenomenology plays any role here, because it sounds like what you're just saying is, well, no, you're just not imagining what you think you are, which is a move that can be made in lots of different ways. Because
the way in which the argument is resisted. So I resist this Kripkean idea that something seems pain is pain, and you can say no, directly say no, but for here there is a reason. There might be an empirical reason on many assumptions which might not be the case or whatever, but we are using, if there is conceptual room for that, that's enough for resisting the argument. So it doesn't matter whether.
Isn't there two different senses of the word seeming going on here? So on the one hand, it's a cognitive seeming. On the other hand, it's phenomenological. So I took it that Kripke's, you could put it a different way, but one way of putting Kripke's point is that if it seems to you you're in pain, then you are, where he means like if you feel something painful, then you're in pain. It doesn't mean like if you believe you're in pain or something, although that's
that's fine. But how do we know, how do we come to know which state we are? So it depends. So if it's like, the first one is like saying, oh, if it's pain, it's pain. That's sure. I have no doubts with that. But the question is whether it's pain. If one, so the problem there is that when you move from the primary intention to the secondary intention, is granted by those kind of claims. Of course, if something feels like pain in the phenomenological sense, then it is pain. But the primary intention is not fixed, or it's conceivable, or it's coherent, that the primary intention is not fixed by the phenomenology, but is fixed by the access we have to the phenomenology. And this is what would justify breaking this. That would be that was the idea that I intended to develop there.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I think that's that's a really interesting idea. I think that's not the standard way the zombie argument is presented. I think the primary intention is supposed to be exactly fixed by the phenomenology.
Yeah, but the question is, so in order to we first the primary intention we need access. We wouldn't have any concept if we lack access to our. It would come like, I need to notice it. I need to notice that, and I need to form the relative concept. That seems to be something that depends on access, on the cognitive access we have. That's something, a capacity that we have on the basis of. And now, if it's an open question on the assumption that it's at least an empirical question whether the cognitive access is constitutive of not of the phenomenology, that leaves open the possibility that the primary intention, which clearly depends, okay, that was like too much, which I argue that depends on the access, could be taken apart from the.
Yeah, so I like this idea, but I don't want to defend zombies either. I'm no friend of the zombies. I take the stronger view; they're not even conceivable. Yeah. So I'm not trying to push a zombie argument against you, but I'm just. It seems that I think a lot of these people who want to defend this view are going to say it's not cognitive access; it's like direct, it's acquaintance. that's a different kind of thing than the cognitive access. There's some kind of access there, but it's not causal, it's not cognitive, it's this other mysterious thing, which I can't make sense of. But
why is not that big? Well, fine, if they're right, that's fine. So I'm postulating an hypothetical architecture that we have. So if this is one architecture that we have, and this is, so some people think that access is the cognitive access constitutive of the phenomenology. Yeah. So it has to be this one. And my impression is that those who want to say that, they are begging the question against a view like mine. I mean, this is one strategy to try to resist, might or might not work, but it seems that being willing to say that you need to have this form, this access, this direct access, this acquaintance, might be begging the. So why? What justify these claims? Like, I have this immediate. I was like, well, maybe you are just, you're preparing the argument and then you win. You definitely win. So it's like, why do I need? It's like, oh, but I have this. Yeah, fine. So if maybe in architectures like us, phenomenology and access always go hand by hand. It's like that. There are like, it seems to be this empirical debate. So people tend to accept that it's an empirical claim, but if it's an empirical claim, we're talking about an a priori argument. So then it's like, oh, here you have an architecture, you have the state with the magic, and you have the state that allows you to form the concepts that you are deploying. So the one that, So my impression is that.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's fine. Go.
I was just going to say, it seems like the argument is it really depends on a certain conception of consciousness. It sort of seems like it depends more on just the distinction between access and phenomenal consciousness. It depends also on denying acquaintance.
Yeah, probably. I haven't thought about that this way. So I was hearing the other day. I was like watching some of your videos, and you were discussing with Philip Goff about concepts and some discussion. So one interesting thing that you brought about was the idea. So everybody's gonna say that the concepts that the phenomenal concept are somehow different without endorsing something like phenomenal concept strategy. They have to be like, that they're different. They have to be something special about them because, it's conceptually, when I think about that, consciousness is weird. So that's something that we all will. Well, at least we accept. So I think that's something like this. Somebody want to say, oh, and they're like that because of acquaintance, then fine, argue about that. So some people think that, I don't think that we are completely infallible with regard to our experience, like we're better than anyone. I think that we are infallible with regard to the first person deployment, that the fact that it's me, the one that is having the experience. But maybe, I'm not completely sure, but that's also something that you did in the past. Maybe we were wrong. Those are cases that might be right or might be wrong, but I might think that I'm in pain when, it's pressure rather than that seems so strange to me. And I'm not forced to say, I don't think that everybody would agree that, no, if I say that I'm in pain, I'm really in pain. I don't know. So it's like, we're better than it.
So for those types of cases, I tend to think you really are in pain because it feels like pain to you, but you're not in pain in the first order state of pain. So I tend to take those as in a slightly different way, I think, than maybe some other people would.
But it's, there is debate, but at least the other position is not completely incoherent. All that I'm saying is that we might be wrong. And if you think of an architecture in which you have phenomenology and you have access, what you think depends on the access, and you have two mechanisms. Whenever that you have two mechanisms, things can get wrong. Right. So if you think that these things can be taken apart, then what you think about your experience can be, even if always or in most of the cases, it get it right. So
yeah, and the general strategy is one I'm very fond of. I've argued for a long time that the best response for physicalists to zombies and stuff is to argue that because I mean, I guess to back up, I do kind of feel the pull sometimes of the zombie world, that it does seem conceivable in some sense, but it's not clear that you're really conceiving what you think you are, that this is a micro-physical duplicate. And I think the analogy with water is really good, because no one claims that you could conceive of a duplicate of our world without water, because water is H2O, but that was something that was empirically discovered, and we might not be at the point where we can, with respect to consciousness in particular, we might not be at that point where we have the theory, like what we needed, the theory of chemistry in order to get water and H2O together. We don't have that yet. So I like exploring the option that what people are conceiving of is a not quite a physical duplicate of the physical world. And I think that's what's interesting about the way that you present the argument. Although I'm skeptical about the distinction between cognitive and phenomenology. I don't really buy that. But even so, I think the argument's very interesting.
Fair enough. So I don't think that there has to be. I mean, I think I really like the conceivability argument. At some points, I get a little bit bored, but it's a nice way of articulating what would be the relation and thinking about the metaphysics and what's difficult. And I think it's a great and interesting arguments, and there are different ways to think about it. I mean, it's committed to something like rationalism. To be rationalist about modality, and I tend to not to be one of those, but nonetheless, I like it. Let articulate different metaphysical positions very easily. So and then I don't even know. I'm not super convinced that this is the best reply, but
okay.
It helps to think of different architectures, different possibilities, and why we find it mysterious or whatnot. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So I don't want to keep you around forever, but I do want to make sure we have time to talk about quantum mechanics, which you've got a really interesting paper coming out. And there's a couple of things I really like about that paper. One is that you try to do it from the point of view of a physicalist, which I think is really cool, and something that I wish more people would explore. And two, just that you take quantum mechanics seriously, because it's kind of frustrating, almost 100 years after it's being fairly well empirically established. I mean, in my personal view, we're not going to have a theory that surpasses quantum mechanics. We'll have a theory maybe that encompasses it, but it's not going to go away. We're not going to find out that it was wrong in any of its, it maybe needs to be expanded or whatever. But so anyway, I'm rambling. But the point is that I think it needs to be taken seriously, and we need to think about it as telling us something important about the world, and taking that seriously might have something to do with consciousness. So I know there's a lot of mathematics in the paper, and we don't have the space to go over that. But can you tell us something about what is it that you think the relationship there that you're trying to develop?
So here is the main idea, or the origins. So let me take a little bit talk briefly historically about the paper. So I always read. So in one of the most important, a long time ago, it used to be a very good conference in consciousness. Now I'm more skeptic about that in the science of towards science of consciousness. Well, many people working on interested in quantum mechanics, and I always thought, so it's like, it seems that it's easily to empirically find out. And I read a paper in Nature by Koch, and I cannot remember, a physicist, and it didn't work. So STAP has a good reply, and it's incorrect, despite of the fact that it's. And I was lucky enough that one of my colleagues here works on foundations of quantum mechanics. We were discussing, and we come to write a paper on how this could be done, because it's not that easy, and things get. And then I came to a paper. So when I was interested in this relation between quantum mechanics by Colin McQueen and Dave Chalmers, and on the relation between consciousness and quantum mechanics. But the problem there was like it wasn't clear what the dynamic was. So here's how it's supposed to go. From the very beginning of quantum mechanics, people have postulated that the collapse of the wave function. So in quantum mechanics, you have these possible, whenever you have these possible states, so like a particle being here and a particle being there, mathematically in the Hilbert space, it's possible another state, which is the superposition, which neither one nor the other nor two. It's this kind of weird states. However, we never observe that. So whenever that we make a measurement, we observe either here or there, or spin up and spin down. And this is something that has to be explained. Here's one explanation. So we don't, consciousness make these things collapse, or we don't have, it's not possible to be conscious of a superposition, right? Or in the paper, we also distinguish two things. To be conscious of a superposition, that is something that will not happen. We never have an experience as on the spin up and a spin down. And the superposition of two mental states. So being in a superposition of perceiving this and perceiving that. And we try to figure out how this could be done. So how one thing that has been proposed since the early days of quantum mechanics is that consciousness is the thing that makes the wave function collapse. So what is requires what happens? So how is this relation mathematically possible? And then what we make use is use of a theory that's called CSL, in which you have a parameter that allows you that whenever something happens, you get very quickly out of the superposition. So this is the simplest way to explain it. So you have this parameter and you make it to depend on consciousness. For the sake of the discussion, not that I find them very promising, we make use of integrated information theory because it offers the phi, a parameter which can be introduced in the function. Now, what you do is that whenever that you have a certain value of this, you get very quickly. So you have a superposition of these two experiences, but very, very, very quickly you get out of these states. And this is something that you can do with CSL. There is some mathematical, it is not very complicated. The basic idea, for those that do not know quantum mechanics, not that I know a lot about, is just this. Whenever that you get into the conscious state, you very quickly, so the dynamic is so that you very quickly get out. So you really get into the superposition, but very quickly get out of these states. And this is what we do in the paper. It's a variation of a theory that already exists, which is CSL, but on which the parameter, rather than depending on locations, depends on consciousness.
So CSL, I'm not very familiar with that, but is that it's a kind of objective collapse theory?
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
It's an objective collapse theory. So basically, as far as I know, there's CSL in the EDP, the objective collapse theory, and this is one of those. Yeah.
Uh-huh. So now, how is this different from the McQueen and Chalmers M property? I mean, I guess one big difference is that they don't allow superpositions ever.
So so you need to allow to the. So here is the fair way to put it. It's just one way of doing what they intended to do. So you need to get the mechanics. So if consciousness do not enter into a superposition, you have the things like the quantum. So you have problems like quantum Zeno effect, and you have and you need to explain what it takes to not enter into a superposition. How is the interaction between M properties and so what is the dynamic? What happens? So what it means mathematically. So give me a formula of how it evolved. So just by saying that M does not enter into a superposition, but then okay, fine, and then how do you need to explain what is the dynamics, and this is something that we do. So it's definitely inspired. So we started to think about it after writing the previous paper, and by seeing Kelvin and Dave proposal and start to think, oh, but how it works. So what does it mean to have an M property that do not enter into a superposition? Oh, here you enter into a superposition. What happens is that you quickly get out of state, something that they also suggest, and we don't have the problems that their theory might have. I mean, they were worried by the quantum Zeno effect. That for those that are not familiar with that, it's just the problem that derives that you get freeze whenever that you make a measurement, you cannot evolve, and then
right. So if you make many measurements over and over and over again, the system stays in the same state.
Exactly.
Right.
And then you or at least in principle, you don't not straightforwardly you do not have this kind of problem, and you have a dynamic. So there are like many. So one famous paper, which is the Many Minds paper, very interesting about what is the independently whether it's dualist or not. In this all famous paper, you have like theory that relates quantum mechanics and consciousness, but then you don't really get what is the interaction. So how do you do that? Or in proposal like in Stubbs' proposal, very complicated, or I'm not going to talk about even more complicated and not clear. Here you have a model of how the things evolve. So, and that's what I think that is the nice part of the paper. So the nice part of the paper is like, oh, if you think that consciousness might play a role in quantum mechanics, here you have a way in which you can make sense of this idea, which is understandable and which is have mathematical predictions. I mean, not seriously. I mean, mathematical predictions, clack, because there's no way to calculate phi, blah blah. But I mean, just take a parameter. So if you have consciousness, if you have a parameter on which that you may correlate with consciousness, here you have mathematical models that allow you to make to offer a dynamics, and you just play with the parameters, and then you get to something coherent. That's what I think that is the nice part of the paper. So we are very much indebted to the ideas that Kelvin and Dave developed. It's just okay, then let's do it, and that's what we did.
I see. So, and the way in which you think that this is compatible with physicalism is that whatever the parameter depends on, so in this case it's phi is a physical system, a property of the brain, so then that makes it a physicalistic quantum approach. I mean,
so the point is that you don't need to postulate, so you can be a physicalist, and so it is compatible with consciousness playing a role in the collapse of the wave function, that you don't need to be dualist. So you just need a parameter, as it is location in normal CSL, or phi in this case, and if a big if IIT were true and IIT were compatible with the truth of physicalism, that many people think that it is, then there you have a model. So you don't need something extra in order to make the collapse, because it would be very weird. I mean, very weird, and I don't have even a clue how it works, how it's supposed to work. If you have something which is not physical, that plays a role in the collapse of the wave function, how is this interaction? So how is the interface between those things? And if it's something physical, how it plays? So this is the nice part of the proposal. So of course, it might be that, as one of the referees will claim in that, IIT might not be a physicalist theory. So
right, that's what I was going to.
So, and that's why, and this is completely right. So nothing in the proposal commits us to physicalism, but it allows to understand how physicalism might be the case, and you can have a theory of in which the collapse of the wave function depends on consciousness.
I see. Okay, so it's not exactly arguing for physicalism. It's just saying it's possible.
Yeah. So here's how you can do it. So some people think Wigner is like, what the heck? So how is it possible that something which is something weird, and this is one problem that we often see when you see people mixing quantum mechanics and consciousness. One get the impression that what the people are doing is getting one weird thing. So here we have two weird things. Yeah. Let's put them together. I mean, interesting thing might appear. It's not that I am confident that this is so that the collapse of the wave function depends on consciousness. It's just rather than here you have a model. Here's a way to understand how this relation might be.
And so, and you're not worried by the panpsychist implications of IIT? That's not something that really matters from your point for this paper. I mean,
no. So I don't even think that. Not at all. I mean, it's like if IIT were the case and panpsychism were the case, then it's a physicalist view. But the nice part is that IIT is there to illustrate the proposal. It's popular, I guess more popular in unfortunately in neuroscience than in philosophy, because I think that is a philosophical. By philosophical, I mean a theoretical proposal. But just plug in whatever a variable. So make consciousness depend on a parameter and plug that in. So I don't know if consciousness were a matter of how many atoms you have, plug in the number of atoms. I mean, I'm saying just a stupid example, but we use IIT because IIT gives you this parameter on which you can parameterize the CSL. So you make a version. We make a version of CSL, in which rather than locations, the collapse depends on consciousness. So I'm not interested at this point in defending IIT. I don't think that. I tend to think that IIT is not related to consciousness. I fail to fundamentally understand it from the philosophical perspective. There are so more development is required if the theory is to make sense. But here it's useful because it's something that is. There are reasons for thinking that integration of information is related to consciousness. It gives you a parameter, and it's helped to illustrate the theory. So it's more for illustrative purposes than for a commitment with IIT.
Well, just as an aside too, I'd say I'm not sure that it's popular in neuroscience. I think it has a couple of high-profile endorsers, and that's kind of inflated the sense in which neuroscientists are allegedly infatuated with it. I don't know, but so that's neither here nor there. But I understand. I take your point that you're saying is that it's a proof of principle type of thing. IIT is just a nice, handy kind of example. It does make me wonder, though. I mean, so it has to be something that's mathematizable. Like, for instance, it's hard to figure out what kind of parameter you could fit in if you thought higher order theories were true, or if you thought some other kind of theory of consciousness were the case. Like even your own theory of consciousness, what parameter could you put in? It at least it's restricted to those sorts of things which could be mathematizable.
Definitely. So one of the things that I would be willing to think about is like what theories in the market can offer a parameter. So So definitely. So you need a parameter there. So in the theory, you need a parameter. It's not obvious that theory like my own, where first person representations play a role. You have something which you can. So what is this property? But one interesting thing is that from the mathematical perspective, there are things in the world that have that, and things in the world that do not have that. So there has to be a mathematical function.
Right.
I need to think more about that. So I'm now so it's like, those system has to satisfy some constraints, and when those constraints build up a mathematical. I don't know. I'm not sure about it. But you're right. So one of the things that I want to think more about is like what theories are compatible and which theories are not. So what is required? What can be mathematized or not, or whether in principle any theory. If there has to be something in the world. If consciousness is something like, again, real natural kind. Sorry, if it's something like a natural kind, it has to be whatever natural kind means, namely something that exists is there in the world. There has to be some way of mathematizing over the fundamental particles, for example. So if your metaphysics that you have fundamental particles like atoms, strings, or your favorite, then it has to be a function of the relations that those things bear to each other. in which case, I'm not sure about what I'm saying, but that's my inclination now, thinking about that.
That's got to be,
there has to be.
If reality is as we think it is, there's got to be some mathematical relation that could characterize it. I mean, so from my own view, I think that exploring this area in the way that you have is important because of things I said earlier about the way I think quantum mechanics is not going away and won't be superseded. But also I think that what the theory has suggested very strongly is that information acquisition is really the fundamental thing here. That once you come to have information about the state, then it's not reversible. It's not in the superposition anymore. I think I would quibble a little bit with the way you guys characterize superpositions. Not mathematically, obviously, but in terms of it being some weird state of the system. It's definitely not a classical state. And so consciousness seems like one way of getting information. It's not clear to me that you could, so one of the things that would be interesting to find out is whether you could get these kinds of things from unconscious representations, or this is sort of similar to the debate maybe you find about whether measurements themselves count as observations, because really the fundamental thing is observation. But a lot of people want to say, well, no, measurements, just measuring the thing itself is a kind of way of obtaining information. So wherever there's a measurement, there's a non-superposition. But I don't really know what to think about that. That's something.
So this is the data. So it might happen at an unconscious level. So the important thing is that you don't have superposition at the conscious level.
Right.
So this is what we observe. So whether it happens at an unconscious level, maybe. So the explanandum is that we don't find it at a conscious level, which is the level from which we can do things. So at the very least, we need to guarantee this, the fact that we do not observe them by consciously observe them. And this is something, so it would depend on so let me play again with a phi. So there would be different values. There would be certain values of phi that make you get quicker. And if the phi is lower, then you will stay there longer. But the important part is that the time that you spend in a superposition of phi is very, 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 very low. Such that you don't notice, or you don't come to, it doesn't seem to you that you are in those states. And if this is short enough, at the very least, if you make a distinction between the noticing and the state itself, you can explain that. Probably some more people, you might not need to take access and phenomenology apart to do this trick. It's just if it's too short, you don't even come to further think about it.
Yeah, that does present a whole different set of challenges. If you think about like Dave's argument, Chalmers, from dancing and fading qualia, one of the reasons that he thinks, and this is something I know you've worked on, but I don't want to drag us into a whole discussion of it unless we want to. But anyway, if you think about that, one of the claims that he made was that it's just weird that we wouldn't notice that these giant changes would be going on. The apple's there, the apple's not there, and it does seem like this possibility of brief superpositions opens up that question again. Like, why wouldn't we notice? It seems like I would notice no matter how quickly. It seems like it would be very odd if I didn't notice that if I was in a superposition, a non-classical state of somehow seeing the apple red and green or something like that, or red or green, or what even the right way to characterize that is. So those kinds of, that gives me a little bit of pause. What does it even mean for there to be a superposition of conscious qualities? Because for instance, the way not to cut you off, but the way I would interpret the superposition is not by saying that the state is both spin up and spin down. That clearly to me that's nonsensical. That's quantum mechanics doesn't dictate that at all. It says that, well, it's in one or the other, and so that the plus sign there or the minus sign in the equation should be interpreted as or, not as and.
No, it's important that the superposition is not an or state. It's not an and state, but it's not an or state. It's a different state. So it's not being in this state or being in this state. It's a different state.
Why is that important?
that's what a superposition is. So a superposition is not a matter of being in this state or being in this state. It's a matter of being in a different state, which is a superposition of both, as far as I understand quantum mechanics.
Well,
Now,
it depends on the interpretation of quantum. I mean, so the Copenhagen interpretation, I think, which I'm sort of espousing, isn't going to say that. It's going to say, yeah, there's a non-classical state there, but what it tells you is that when you check, you're going to find one or the other, and that's always what we find.
But that's an epistemic. Okay, fine. That's so those are not the theories we are dealing with, in which is just is an epistemic question. So we're being realistic about those states. So it's not an epistemic problem, which is the one that you were mentioning. So
right. That's what I was saying. That depends on a real interpretation of quantum mechanics.
You're absolutely right. Now, coming back to the fading and dancing qualia, which is an argument that I like a lot, and that's one of reasons I've always been willing to endorse some form of functionalism. Is so there is a difference. So in the dancing qualia, you can go as low as you want. So red, green, red, green. Now, things happen in the world. So think of an experience, a photogram. So imagine that you think that subliminal, by saying subliminal, I'm making it unconscious. Now, here is one view of what is going on when you put a frame within the 24. So two explanations. I mean, for the times, I'm not worried about the particular time and just building up an analogy.
Right.
So here's one thing that one might think that what's going on, if that frame were able to reach consciousness, which probably does not, blah, 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 that's not interesting. So one thing that may happen is that the frame does not reach consciousness, and so you have an equal experience the whole time. Here is an alternative, so that consciousness really quickly changed, but you fail to notice that. So this is not as weird as the case of the dancing qualia, because those are like, you can be there for 1 minute. Right. It doesn't matter. So I can just play. It's not like in which you don't even come to notice. I don't find it so problematic. It's like, insofar as you don't come to notice. I mean, it's weird if we don't notice if we fail to notice stable states of consciousness. I have the gorilla. I'm not so interested into discussing. I mean, it's very interesting in the gorilla. But the gorilla, you call me, look at the gorilla, and I look at the gorilla and look for the gorilla, and I don't fail to see. That would be very weird.
Right.
So it's like,
but on this, I guess the weirdness I was getting at is that on this view, it seems like every time you open your eyes, there's a brief superposition. Every time you change you look at different place, there's a collapse of a superposition. And I guess what you're saying is if it happens really quickly, then it's not that surprising that you don't notice it. But it seems to me that's still surprising.
Okay, here's
no matter how quick, unless it was like you said, subliminal, in which case the theory is not talking about it.
Let me then develop your worry a little bit further to see whether I get it. So here is your idea. It's like, okay, I grant you that with one you convince me that one might work when I open my eyes and look at this table and make it collapse, no problem. But that happens the whole time. So whenever I'm looking, so it has to be a continuous not noticing things,
right?
Which is problematic. That's interesting. I need to think about it. That's that way of putting. I don't know. I need to think more about it.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, that's fine. That's a good enough response. I'm noticing we're getting on in time, so I can't keep you forever. You've been very generous with your time. But before we go, I wonder. Thank you. I wonder if there's anything that hasn't come up yet that you would like to bring up. And the answer can be no. That's fine.
I'm very happy to keep discussing. For ages, so that has been most of the things that I have been working on. So, as you know, did some work on the relation with cognitive access with dreams, but there is no far more that I think that's worth discussing. That the arguments there, some things on vagueness and how whether we come to distinguish qualities in the world, and I'm also working on that. But it's like most of the things that I'm doing have appeared. I'm happy to present and discuss my ideas and contrast it with sufficiently close ideas and sufficiently different ideas as the one that you have, and it has been a real pleasure. So I don't know whether you
Well, I do
want
know that
to.
so you just mentioned the vagueness. I know you have a paper on the phenomenological varieties.
Yeah.
Is that
So
what you were talking about?
yeah, so that was just because it came recently, and I have been working on that, and now I'm working on something similar, precisely related to the quality space theory. So I'm writing a paper with a friend of mine, with James Tassiker, uh, related against the idea that consciousness can be awareness of qualities.
Uh-huh.
So as you,
So I like
so
James's work, and so can you tell me a little bit about that? I'm not familiar with that.
so it's still, we're still working on the final version and submitting that. But basically the idea is that, so as you know, most defenders of higher theories think that you can think of qualities, the redness of the experience, that they exist unconsciously, and then you have some sort of awareness of those qualities, and this is the difference with consciousness. So what we try to argue is that what justifies to call those states qualities, namely that they can individuate state of consciousness. So there has to be things that can appear conscious. What we try to argue is that there has to be states of those that do not fully characterize a state of consciousness. Then there is no reason for them to postulate that there is anything like a quality. So I remember when I went for the first time to New York, and I hang out with all those fans of higher theories, which I learned a lot. At the very beginning, it was very tough for me to understand this notion of quality. And then it was really, really easy. And whenever I teach consciousness, that's what I teach most of the time. I tell, whether you want to like it, you have to understand what is the nature of these states. And here's what the theory postulates. And I always tended to be that more like a kind of terminological discussion. So what we then try to do is like whether it deserves to be called to be called qualitative. And this is relevant because one way of thinking of consciousness is as an awareness of qualities, and I try to we try to attack this way of thinking. So the subjective aspect, or the awareness, and the qualitative aspect have to go hand by hand. And there seems to be something more than just terminological. And basically what we try to argue is that those things that we are aware of do not deserve the name qualitative, insofar as they have to be circumstances under which they characterize the state of consciousness. As soon as I have it, I will share it with you.
Well, I would like to see it, actually, but let me see if I understand what you're saying, because I'm not sure if I'm getting the argument entirely, which I'm not saying is your fault. So on the, by the way, first of all, it's not just higher order theories that take this view, but someone like
I know,
but since I work,
definitely. So some people,
But so anyway,
go. You go.
So insofar as I understand the view, for someone like Rosenthal, the idea is that, well, look, we have these states. They're in our behavior. They control our behavior. They're manifest in the behavior, in a sense. And the particular behavior is the noticing the differences between stimuli, especially the just noticeable differences. An animal, you present two stimuli, you say same, different, or not. And you do that for like every possible imaginable stimulus that you can find, and you map out the quality space of the organism. So that, he thinks, can be done unconsciously. You could do that subliminally, present something subliminally and say same, different. They say, how the hell do I know? You say guess. they say, I don't know, maybe different. And so you could map out the entire space of their discriminatory abilities. And then, so I take it you're not objecting to that. You're objecting to the further step that those things that are mapped out are qualitative in some sense.
Exactly.
Okay.
And by qualitative, here is one thing that the word qualitative is worth, is that it can characterize a state of consciousness. It can individuate a state of consciousness. So what we try to do is, like, of course you have this map, that's fine. But if something is qualitative, if it can, for a system like, for a cognitive system like ours, come to characterize a state of consciousness, we try to argue is that they cannot. So it's in that sense that they are not, if by qualitative, I guess that this is something that David stressed. So people before that David, so people like Hume, but he stresses in his book, and not so much in recent papers, that something is qualitative. The motivation for calling this thing qualitative, it's because this thing that is there in this map is the kind of thing that is revealed in consciousness. So
yeah, so I guess that's the part I'm not tracking. So you show an organism something red, and they say it's red, and then you show them that thing subliminally, so that they say they don't see anything, but they're able to press a button. You ask them, press this button if it's red, that button if it's green, and they press the right button. So I thought the motivation for calling it qualitative was simply that it's the same stimulus, it's in the behavior, and it's the sort of thing which you could be aware of. In some cases you are, in some cases you aren't. So why wouldn't we call it qualitative if it's functioning the same in behavior? It is the sort of thing that could be, you could be aware of, by which you'd have to play some kind of concept describing it. But so in that sense, it is something that characterizes a state of consciousness, but it need not. Okay. So I'm wondering what the connection is supposed to be.
So the question is that you cannot be aware of all of this. So you say you could be aware. So what we try to argue is that for systems like us, you're accepting that when you are aware of it, that's what makes it conscious, and that's what I meant by saying that it characterize or individuate the particular conscious states. So you are right. So this is a definition that we take to be of what is qualitative. And the question is that there are more at the basic level than the ones that you can be aware of. Therefore, they do not deserve, precisely because of that. So that's like the
I see. Yeah, but so I guess the response then would be is that we're aware of these not by having an individual concept of them, but by comparative means. You know, this one is not like that one, or this one is different than that one, and so they can figure in conscious experience at least in that way.
So this is where some principle, like the principle of transparent differences. So here's one principle that it seems was present, a form of transparency that seems to be undeniable. It's that if a subject is aware that their mental qualities differ only if the properties outside appear to differ. And that's so with this minimal requirement, we try to argue that you cannot be aware of those. You are not aware of those qualities. And if you cannot be aware of those, then they do not deserve the term quality. So it is in this sense precisely the one that you mentioned. So you make these discriminations, and on top of that, you can be aware of that. That's what we mean. We say that they can, for an architecture like us, characterize the state of consciousness.
Even if in comparative terms, I mean, you don't deny, or do you deny that we often use comparative concepts? Like, you know, I mean, the classic, the reason why this always comes up is the memory color experiment. So you present the memory, you present one color serially, one after another. People are very bad at saying whether or not they're the same or different. You present them at the same time. People are very good at saying whether they're different or not. So the inference from this has typically been that, well, we don't have individual concepts for those colors, but that we can employ comparative concepts. This one's bluer, that one's darker. So in that way, they can show up, characterize conscious experience.
So the question is that you need to postulate. So even in those cases when they are presented at the same time, here's one thing that happens. So you have like three colors. This one, you cannot discriminate from this one. You cannot discriminate this one from this one, but you can miss these two. You need three qualities, right? But they do not show up in your experience. So it's not something that they do not phenomenologically individuate certain states. So at least we try to argue for those reasons that it's better not to think of consciousness awareness of qualities. If something, as you mentioned, deserves the name qualitative, if it plays a role in the kind of behavioral individuation that you make, and is something that can individuate the state of consciousness. I need to read the paper now to see what can you do comparatively and what not, just to check this objection. And when I have the draft, I would be happy to share it with you if you don't mind to have a look to that. And
yes, please. I would like to have a look for that. I think also some of it depends on what you mean by aware of. So, the way I interpret this sort of stuff is that you're aware of it by describing something, so that it's I am seeing red, or I am seeing something darker than this. You're describing the states that are driving your behavior. Whether I don't really care if they're called qualities or not. There's some kind of state which represents or tracks or is importantly involved in keeping track of properties out there in the world. If you wanted to call them something else, I'm not sure what would really hang on that. I think a lot of what David's resisting is just that people think that, well, those states have to be intrinsically associated with consciousness. And he wants to say, no, but what reason do we have for not saying that it's red? Because you showed the person a red stimulus and they're pressing a button saying, I see red. And so it seems folk psychologically, it's the same sort of thing as when you are conscious.
I'm just using the being aware of, because you mentioned it. The way in which we intend to present it in the paper is by states that individuate the kind of experience you are. So a quality, something is a quality if it's the kind of things that make this state the kind of state that phenomenologically that is different from that one and similar to this other one. Nice. So that's and then if you think that it's an awareness of this thing, that's something over and above. But in principle, qualities are the kind of stuff that can, it's not always, so it's open. It's, of course, it has to be open to discussion whether it has to, but under certain conditions, it can individuate a phenomenological state.
Yes, I see. So I guess, yeah, I would want to say that that would be, you're talking about something in the higher order state itself at that point, but that's my own distinct way of thinking about these things. So that's very interesting. Yeah, I look forward to getting that paper from you. I'm kind of hearing baby sounds from the other room, so I'm thinking I have to go and attend to what's going on before we have another interruption. Another circus coming to town.
Terrific.
Miguel, thank you very much for joining me. It's been a great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for having me here. And thanks for the discussion. Looking forward to some more discussions of those things related here whenever you want. And congratulations for this project. It's great. I'm having fun hearing other people and your interviews. And thanks for having me.
Cool. Awesome. All right. So stay on for just a second. I'll talk to you for just a second afterwards.